First of all, introduce myself. I'm Eric Wishart. I'm the president of the FCC, and it's my great honour, privilege, and delight to introduce Mr. Dante Paradiso today, a fascinating speaker who has just written this book, Embassy: A Story of War and Diplomacy. Dante goes back, his time in the Foreign Service goes back to 2002, but he was actually in the embassy in Tanzania in 1998 when it was blown up by Al-Qaeda. Despite that, he stuck with it. He's like many journalists I know, he's a diplomat who just seems to be drawn to hotspots in Asia and in Africa. And he's also a lawyer and an author, and is also a media commentator, so extremely interesting diplomat with a very rich background. And I think it's particularly significant today that we're talking that you're here. You're currently working at the US consulate, but it's very important that you wrote this book and that people can see in this time of Donald Trump, when the State Department is facing a 30% budget cut, and the whole question of US diplomacy has a question mark hanging over it, that when you read this book, you realize how important it is to have strong US and international diplomacy around the world, and how important it is to sustain it. So, and also, from my experience in AFP, the relationship in hostile environments, difficult countries, between diplomats and journalists is often very close and can also be an issue of life and death. So I'm delighted to introduce Dante today. Please, take this down.
Well, thank you guys all for coming out. My job is to keep you awake after lunch. So, look, it's a high honor to be at the Foreign Correspondents Club. You know, I would say that this is a legendary club, but that usually implies something about the past. This is a living, vibrant institution that plays a critically important role in highlighting high professional standards and freedom of the press, particularly in this day and age where there's a lot of different news sources. We hear a lot about fake news. To have an organization that's committed to the standards of information and getting vital information to the public is of critical importance. So a real honor to be here. I want to thank Eric, Florence, Elaine, Tara Joseph, and others for giving me an opportunity to address you guys today. And thank you all for coming out. I also want to give two mentions to a couple folks in the audience. The first is my colleague from the UK, David Lelliott over here, who served with me in Liberia. He's a British diplomat, generally a deputy chief of mission right now. And also my wife, Dante Paradiso, who's down here in front, and she works at the US consulate here. Yeah. So thank you guys all for supporting. You know, my topic today is the interplay between journalists and diplomats in times of war. And we had to get the wordsmithing right so it didn't make it sound like we were at war with each other. This is in times of war, how do we interact with each other? I wanted to give you guys some general thoughts on what diplomats do in times of war and the differences between the roles of journalists. I'm going to speak specifically about the role of reporting officers. Because there's a lot of different kind of diplomats. We see the high-level diplomacy of ambassadors and special envoys shuttling between countries, having what I would call parlor diplomacy, meeting in very staged and very managed interactions with high-level officials of other states. It's often what we think about when we think of high international diplomacy. But there's another type of diplomacy that has long been practiced, which is to have diplomats go out and actually report on what they're seeing in the country. And that information flows back to capitals and allows countries to make decisions on their response to whatever crisis might be happening in a given country. So when I talk about diplomats, what I'm really talking about today is reporting officers, and particularly political reporting officers who follow the political events of a country. These are folks like myself who play roles in compiling in U.S. diplomacy, the human rights report that everybody's well aware of, or our trafficking in persons report. So our role is to meet a very, very broad network of people, from the highest level officials in government of a given location that we're in to what we would call here, call on the mainland, Laobaixing, right? To meet the regular people, get a sense of what's going on in the country, and allow us to make decisions. So what I wanted to start with is that in war, in times of war or times of conflict and civil disturbance, we actually do very similar work to journalists. So let's talk about, the first thing is that I would say there's three characteristics to the work that we're both doing. The first is we bear witness. It's that physics phenomenon where something exists because it's being observed. A critically important function of the press, but it's also important for what we do. We are actually seeing what is going on, trying to understand it in a country in crisis. The second thing is that we are all the first cut at the historical record. So I'm sort of amazed at the pace of the information flow in this day and age, where we all live a common experience through the news, through our friends, through our social media, through our own experiences. And then 2 months later, or 3 months later, you start to see people doing forensic reports on, well, let's see what really happened. It was, well, wait a second, I just lived that a couple months ago, and now we're actually finding out what the facts are. Well, journalism and journalists are the ones who are the first ones to bring forward and bring to light those facts. It's what historians would call primary source material, but it's the lifeblood of what journalism is. It's also true for political reporters. What we're doing is creating an actual record of the perceptions of a government of events that are happening. And the third part, which can come across a little controversial, is we're advocates. We collectively make the case for action. And I know right now that's not probably that controversial a topic within the media community, beyond journalism, the media community, because everybody is branded and everybody has opinions, and there's a sort of an advocacy component that's often built into that. But of course we have to remember there's still this idea of objective facts, and what is fundamentally the purpose of those facts, though? What's the reason for doing it? When I got started in this business a long, long time ago, I took a course called The Media and International Human Rights Law with a journalist named Ed Girardet. And Ed was a longtime correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor and a bunch of other publications, wrote a great book on Afghanistan. He's currently heading up a project about more or less objective journalism called Global Geneva. Ed was sort of my first entree into, okay, well, in reporting, what is the media really doing? It's getting information to the public. Of course, you can say, well, that's so the public can do what it wants with that information. But at the end of the day, if you're witnessing human rights abuses, if you're witnessing massacres, if you're witnessing state-sponsored terrorism, there is a component of the very fact of your reporting can force decision-making. And frankly, if it's completely passive and the intent is actually not to have people act on it, then it's a kind of a cruel role. But I don't really think that's the case. I think most people go in because they understand that if I bring a story to light, there's a chance that it can be acted on. So it plays a critical role in resolving conflict and human rights and addressing human rights concerns. So on the diplomatic side, we're actually advocates. We're actually advocates very much so internal to our governments on, hey, this is the response we should have. And that response can be stay out of it. Or that response can be let's bring some resources to bear, let's marshal the international community, let's try to do something. So again, in the inform aspect of media and journalism, it's inform for what purpose? And I would say that there is an advocacy component there. So what's interesting, and I was discussing a little bit with Eric, is that in times of war, you can go a couple different ways. Often embassies are seen as black boxes, or diplomatic platforms are seen as very closed off. We're all too familiar with people buttoning up in front of the press. We give very prepared statements. We're trying to fall in line with policy, and we're trying to follow guidance from our capitals. And so we say very little. But actually, in a highly intense crisis situation where there are bullets in the streets, tear gas, crowds running around, whatever the situation is, often, not always, but often, journalists and diplomats work quite closely together. So what are a couple of the things that we do together to perform our missions that are somewhat similar? The first thing we do is we exchange information. So a lot of times you see things like, oh, well, that was said on background. Okay, so we all know that aspect of it. But other times it's just simply trying to get a handle on what's actually happening. A diplomat has access to a whole host of resources from an embassy, multiple nodes of contact with the society, from our own contacts that are out there, and also from the various people that work within our mission. They're all engaging a society at the same time, same as journalists. But when we discuss with each other, often offline, often at a place like the FCC, or a bar, or the FCC bar, we can trade information. And what that can do, particularly from a diplomacy side, is it allows us, many times we're under restrictions. We can't go on record. We're not allowed to say something. But what we can do is we often can confirm facts. We can say, hey, here's the context. Or, yeah, actually, we've spoken to similar people, and so a journalist can actually verify that their sourcing is correct. It's the same thing for us. We can have a sense, if you're seeing things the same way we are, then maybe there's real truth to the facts at hand. The second thing is that we can get messages out through the media, and the media can get headlines from us. So there's a transactional nature to these exchanges. And then the third thing, and Eric and I talked a little bit about this, but only briefly, is there's safety. And in today's world where international actors in many crises and many difficult spots around the world, including places that are not in crises but have, for example, a terrorist attack or a natural disaster, the ability to exchange information about physical safety. Consulates and embassies can provide shelter for journalists that are in trouble. We often can provide resources, put people in contact with somebody who's conducting an evacuation. And at the same time, when our people are out in the society, the information sometimes that we exchange on a very collegial basis can lead to us knowing, oh, you know what, if I go down that road, there's a checkpoint and they're targeting diplomats. So this is very, very real, serious business as to what we do to actually support each other. Now, there are, of course, differences. So I want to just spend a moment on the differences that we have between us that can make working together hard at times and cause friction in the relationship. The first is we're serving really different decision makers. As a U.S. diplomat, I'm reporting up through State Department channels and ultimately to the National Security Council and the President. So that's really who I'm ultimately beholden to. There's a dimension of the American public more broadly, but my chain of command runs up to the President. For journalists, it's the public and, of course, your editor. at certain times, there's going to also be the business model. I mean, what are we doing? Why are we actually bringing this information forward? The second thing, and I find this one probably the most interesting point, is we often have very, very different time frames. So in journalism, it's almost always what is the news, what is breaking. I mean, you can write a long feature piece, which we love to read, and they're research, but in general, it's what's happening now, and the timeliness of the information makes it newsworthy. Whereas for diplomats, often we see the world in very much of a longer time frame, in the sense that I know that a breakdown in negotiations right now, which would be headline newsworthy for everybody who's practicing as a journalist, is potentially just a blip. And that tomorrow, that is going to flip. And so if the headline comes out, negotiations have broken down, which would be a true statement at that moment, it can change the nature of the negotiations. Whereas I know, hey, tomorrow we wake up and we're going to try again and again and again. And so my equity is actually to not have that information come out at that time, to not undermine confidence from all sides in a complex negotiation that this thing is going to be dragged across the finish line. And so there can be some real conflict in the difference between a policy process that's underway and a news cycle. And then finally, again, the objectives can be different in that. One, again, is the news. The second is the ends of policy. We also do run into the problem of operational security versus breaking news. And this is a strange one, which is, you guys may be trying to, or journalists may be trying to confirm, for example, that there are tanks outside an embassy, or that they're shelling an embassy. And in Liberia, we actually had this situation where we were sheltering people to prepare them for evacuation. And mortar shells started hitting our compound. And so everybody in the media who we were sheltering and they were waiting for evacuation helicopters was like, okay, I got to get on the phone to my editor and say the US compound has been shelled. But for us, we were like, well, if everybody out there starts to hear on radio that the compound is being shelled, then the people doing the shelling have confirmation that you're hitting us. And if we are the target, you are actually assisting them to direct the fire against yourselves. So there's operational security stuff that, 2 days later is no longer newsworthy, or might be newsworthy, but would be no problem. The shells hit the embassy. Everybody knows it. We're not trying to hide that fact. And yet the fact is you're also trying to protect safety. And so there's a real balance there. I'm going to give 3 quick stories of sort of how these tensions play out in the real world and in some experiences I've had. The first is one where it was actually some friction between, I would say, the diplomatic and military apparatus of the military and the press. And it was an interesting case because I got to Afghanistan in July of 2009, which was a time that President Obama and the generals were trying to figure out whether they surged troops into Afghanistan to try to stabilize the situation. And they were in a review process, and General McChrystal was new on the ground, and he was going to try to do a new strategy for Afghanistan. And a conflict broke out in a remote mountain town in Nuristan. And for those not familiar with Afghan geography, this is way up in the Hindu Kush. It's a unique cultural region with hardly any people because it is just absolutely horrendous terrain to do anything in, farm, fight, whatever. But it's a terrible place to be, and strategically of no importance. But an Afghan town had been overrun. And, General McChrystal got a call, and Ambassador Eikenberry got calls, and they said, well, you got to go up and help our government up in that area. Well, to do that, you have to run an extremely complex logistical operation involving helicopters that are going in under cover of darkness so that they don't get shot out of the sky. And we sent the troops up. But our objective at the time, militarily, was actually to pull troops out of these type of locations. This is exactly the place you didn't want to be. 10,000-foot ridge lines surrounding you. You're in a bowl at the base of a river, in a riverbed, and anybody can just direct fire down into you. So, but our troops had to go, and the reason was the relationship with the Afghan government. I think folks didn't want to say no. They didn't want to say, hey, if we're asked, we're full partners. The Afghan government wants our troops up there to support their troops. We're going to go up there. But as a tactical matter and a long-term strategic matter, it made no sense to be up there. Well, we went, and now we're all of a sudden other places that we were trying to withdraw from for exactly those reasons. We couldn't, because we had to take all our operational capacity to sustain, 100 troops and Afghan troops up in this remote area. Snipers started coming in, started picking off our people, started picking off the Afghans, and it was a bad situation. Naturally, this is newsworthy. This is something that journalists who say, well, as a tactical matter, this makes no sense. We should put this out there. We should give this information to decision makers. So journalists were calling saying, hey, can we get on a helicopter up there? Because there actually was no way to get up there. You can't drive up there. The roads were all washed out. You can't get up there on a donkey. That would take like 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So, you could hike, but, that's going to take you a long time, and you might not come back. So, people were looking for embeds to carry them up there. And, of course, my objective was to say, here's the policy process. We're trying to make the case internally to the US government and the Afghan government that we shouldn't be there. And the more attention we draw to it, the problem is you can embarrass people. And what happens when leaders get embarrassed often is they dig in their heels, and all of a sudden you're there for a much longer time period. A Wall Street Journal reporter made it up there, reported, the story didn't go that far because, frankly, there was so much else going on. It took several months to get our troops out, and we lost people as a result. But that was an interesting time where it wasn't really so much about trading information, because we were able to give the information, hey, look, this is a place we shouldn't be. But if we had gone out at the tactical level and said we shouldn't be there, then we're directly confronting our chain of command, and we're creating problems for ourselves where they may say, okay, we don't want to hear from you, and we hurt our own credibility internally. But a real conflict between how we work together. And of course, on the safety side, the embeds are really our responsibility. So it's one of those tricky situations where you put somebody on a helicopter, they go up there, they're independent actually, and they can write what they want, they can say what they want, and yet they're fully reliant on the military, in this case the US military, for their safety and security. So that's a case where things were difficult, but you understand the different imperatives that we both had. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, and just to do that, I want to talk about this dynamic as happened in Liberia in 2003. And very briefly, I'll just set a very, very brief context, which was in 2003, Liberia reached a point of crisis, and it was either going to dissolve as a state and be a Somalia on the west coast of Africa, or it was going to pull together. And there was a warlord there named Charles Taylor, who was famous for blood diamonds, which was diamonds mined by essentially forced labor to pay for the conflict, and the widespread use of child soldiers. So that's sort of how he came to power. But at this point in time, two rebel armies that used exactly the same methods were trying to overthrow him. And a peace conference was patched together in Ghana. And Charles Taylor went there, and an international court, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, indicted him on the first day of the peace conference. And it threw everything into chaos. Because what happened was, people said, well, okay, so he's not legitimate, and they were hoping the Ghanaians would render him immediately to the court. So you had a situation where an army of mercenaries and child soldiers was controlling a country, and their head of state, the guy who was the one guy who could control everything, was possibly going to be taken off the board. Well, the streets went crazy, and the rebels took that as an opportunity to attack the capital. And over the next 3 months, they attacked 3 times in an effort to overthrow Charles Taylor. The end result, I'm going to spoil it, is that Charles Taylor left, went off to Nigeria, and international peacekeepers intervened to stop the war. And it led to a transition process that led to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf being elected the first woman president in Africa. So there was a good outcome, but to get to that outcome, we had 3 months of intense conflict with several 100,000 internally displaced people on the streets of a city that already had no power and no running water. It was basically a cesspool. So you had cholera outbreaks, you had child soldiers killing people, and then you had a war in the middle of this. In that time, let's break it down a little bit. The constituencies that we had at the consulate, who we're really concerned about as a U.S. consulate, as a U.S. embassy, were Washington and sort of how they were responding, the Economic Community of West African States, because they would be the ones to send peacekeepers. That would be the manpower to intervene, and the warring parties themselves. Our time frame was as long as it took to get to the right decision. And the challenge was, on a daily basis, we're trying to walk the fine line between this is a crisis that is so bad, no good actors in this. Charles Taylor, 2 rebels, not really anybody to do it. But we can do something as an international community. There's a peace process in the works. We can support the process, and we can intervene to separate the warring parties and try to stop this war. And we can play a role for the benefit of the region, Liberian people, but the world as a whole. So we don't have another broken state on the west coast of Africa. On the media side, it was, hey, here's a crisis, nobody's doing anything about it. And it was a tough balance to walk, but there was that long, short-term objective that we were walking. Our objective was, of course, to maximize coverage, to make the case that this is something that we could do without boxing in policymakers who say, that's going to end up like Somalia, and we don't want to see, in the case of the U.S. forces dragged naked through the streets by a rabble. We don't want to see that. The other thing is there was a big context of Iraq in 2003, but that's subject for a longer time. So the things we did together with journalists was, as I said, traded information. When the war was coming in, hey, who's shelling where? Where are the checkpoints set up? Who is going after who? Are journalists safe to pass there? Does it matter? What about diplomats? Can we be outside of our security perimeter? Can we be engaging? What's the status? So we had a very good and close exchange. The second thing is that from time to time, we would hold a press conference, or we would go talk to people at a place like the Foreign Correspondents Club. At the time, it was a hotel called the Mamba Point Hotel, which was a watering hole for everybody. It was the only international hotel that was open at the time. And everybody converged there. And then the third thing was evacuations. We ended up evacuating a lot of people, and then they came right back in. That was always tough. You know, hey, you just left yesterday, and then you know now it looks a little better, and you're back in the next day. Because again, the journalists with incredible courage were going out there, and if their editor told them, it's not looking good, why don't you come out for a few days? But the imperative was to get back in and tell the story. But in one case, a journalist was, an international photographer was shot through the kidney and dumped at our gate. And we didn't have the ability to actually, all we could do was triage. There was a hospital on the other side of town, which meant going through a whole bunch of checkpoints that were armed by mercenaries and people in service of Taylor's government. You just don't know how they're going to react. Our medic did triage, and eventually we got the person to the JFK hospital on the other side of town and saved his life. I had not been in touch with him for years, and then with social media, was back in touch, and you know he's made it okay. But it was very, very, very touch and go, and those are the kind of things that we do together. How are we doing on time? Do you want one more story, or shall I wrap it up? Yeah, one more story? Okay. So one more story is we're very fortunate here in East Asia right now that we're not dealing with the hot wars that many of us have seen in the past and folks have lived through. So there is conflict, there's low intensity warfare in various places, but you're not dealing with the Vietnam War, the Korean War, these large scale conflicts and chaos that the Foreign Correspondents Club has had journalists coming through here for so many years covering these places. But there are these sort of frozen conflicts, and the Korean conflict is one of them. And I pledged that I would talk a little bit about something topical to Hong Kong and China. And so I'm just going to go back to the past because I had a small insight as a diplomat into the six-party talk process in Beijing. My wife was running the interactions with the press at the time at the embassy, at the U.S. Embassy. I just ran logistics. I made sure that ambassadors got to where they needed to go and all of that kind of stuff. But it was very interesting because, at that time, diplomatically, our constituents were both Washington, and within Washington, it's not just the president, right? And that's the other thing is you're dealing with multiple constituents. It's the president or people that are supportive of your policy, and then people on whatever side that are trying to undermine your policy. Then you also had the other nations at the peace talks or the denuclearization talks. And so, we were working with Ambassador Christopher Hill, who was our lead at the time, really facilitating this on the US side. And it was very interesting because the journalists wanted that daily readout on what's going on. And he had to make decisions on a daily basis about, okay, how frank am I with everybody that's standing around? And there were literally hundreds of journalists coming out of every meeting. The North Koreans didn't really want to talk to the press. But he was quite expansive, actually. And he would give readouts to, one, allow journalists some insight into the process to see where it was going. But the whole time he had to be thinking, how is what I'm saying playing with whoever my particular intended audience? And some days that audience would have been the North Koreans. I'm actually sending a message through the press to the North Koreans. And other days, it would have actually just been some faction or other in Washington that had strong views about what we were doing. But our fundamental objective at that time was really negotiation. Negotiation somewhat in public. There were very, very private talks about, do you give fuel, do you not give fuel? Do you give food aid, do you not give food aid? What are you going to get in exchange for what you give? Are you going to seal the reactors? Are you going to open up access? That's what the nature of the negotiations was. But what we on our side had to do was try to shape the narrative that works to the advantage of what we saw as our negotiating position. And on the press side, it was, okay, well, the senior official is speaking and seems to be giving a little bit more color and a little bit more insight into what's going on. So that was sort of the dynamic at play there. So in conclusion, and then I'm happy to take some questions, the dynamics between press and diplomats in times of war is incredibly important. It's important for physical safety. It's important for transparency. So sometimes there are things that, I view as a diplomat that, hey, this is a sensitive negotiation point. I don't think people should know. But really, a journalist may see it absolutely differently, that actually it's imperative that these particular points be brought to light so that there can be public discussion about them. And that balance is, part of the dynamic between journalists and diplomats. The transparency, the nature of public decision-making, and then finally, again, I get back to the advocacy piece, which is that both journalists and diplomats play an important role, reporting officers in particular, play an important role in advancing fragile peace processes in times of war, and sometimes putting them at risk, but also trying to shed vital light and try to win the support of key constituencies to, at the end of the day, end conflict. So with that, I will take some questions. And I did want to say I left out some books. It's first come, first serve. They're free. Otherwise, I have to say Amazon.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
John Artunian, doing graduate work at the University of Oxford
Yes.
in the UK, and before that from Yale. So without asking you to comment specifically on current policy, so I'll frame the question as very deliberately open-ended. It seems as though U.S. The way the administration is dealing with the media and kind of selectively leaking information, or not leaking, but releasing information with regard to the Syrian civil war and American participation in the Syrian civil war has been very. It seems as though there have been a lot of dips and twists in the way the U.S. is dealing with the press with regard to information on the extent of U.S. involvement in the Syrian conflict. So how would you evaluate, I think most recently I heard, there's been an influx of troops, but whether or not that's true, the extent, who knows. So how would you evaluate in general terms the U.S. media policy with regard to our involvement in the Syrian civil war conflict?
Yeah. Here's what I'll say. One of the challenges in a hot war, when you're dealing with heavy munitions raining down on a population from whatever source, is that really most folks have to leave. So we don't have our embassy in Syria because of the tensions, but you also don't have very many diplomats on the ground, and there's hardly any diplomats that I'm aware of on the ground in Syria. You also, it's very, very hard for journalists. I do see the drone footage. I see, I've had journalist friends go into some of these towns immediately after conflict is over or while it's going on. It takes incredible courage to bring that story to light. So in terms of how we get information from a conflict like that, it's very, very difficult. And in terms of the posture of the American military, well, of course I rely on my military colleagues to give us updates on that. There are still mechanisms for transparency within the United States in terms of congressional notification, in terms of briefings for journalists and things like that, which the military is still fully engaged in. So there are ways, and then it's really up to the free press to evaluate the nature of that information coming out. But I think the biggest problem in a really hot war like that is just that it's such high risk for anybody to get in there. And as we all know, we have tremendous number of local colleagues around the world that are from places that are in distress, that are risking their lives to bring the story more broadly to the world. There is a dynamic out there where it takes an international voice sometimes to amplify locally developed news and information. It's a little bit understandable because for example, if you want to make the case that, for example, if you're in Nigeria and you want Nigerian troops to go in and help Liberia, well, the Nigerian public needs to be informed, and so they need to hear it from Nigerian voices why this matters to them. So there's always I think, a role for international journalism, international diplomacy to take a look at conflicts like that and open it up. So that's what I was saying.
I'm wondering about the dynamic where even in the systems where the political level really wants to get the bureaucratic analysis, and that can vary from time to time and place to place, but where they want that the bureaucratic systems, centuries-old diplomatic traditions, don't get the information up. So by the time the report has come, up through the State Department or my ministry or the FCO, that at the political level, they've already had a few hours of looking at the reports that come from journalists and others, and they've already formed their view. And it strikes me that there's a qualitative change from where we were maybe 25 years ago, especially the way things move through social media, so it doesn't matter where you are, you don't have to be near a TV. People are looking at their devices and they're saying, oh, Mr. Secretary, or Mr. President, this just, we have this new information. What do you have an observation about that observation and about what maybe the officials can do about that?
Yeah, listen, it's a great point. What I would say is that although the speed of information is there, Folks have to often feel a real-time imperative to make decisions and answer things. In complex crises, we call them complex because they are complex. So while the policy decision potentially can be made on a very short notice, the machinery of government, the machinery of mobilizing resources, particularly in democratic systems where you have congressional oversight of spending, where you have limited funds, you have a whole bunch of things, still takes time to move. So a very broad 30, 40,000 foot policy decision still is going to be implemented by all of this machinery. And when you get down to the more granular level, you're still relying on the information. So for example, I'll give you an example from Liberia. There was a fight internal to the administration over whether we go in, and the Defense Department, not the soldiers, but the civilian side, did not want to go into Liberia. And there was a side on the civilian side, particularly led by Secretary of State Colin Powell, who said we can actually make a difference in this conflict. So there was this tension between that. And that meant that although the president, writ broad, said, let's go in and help Liberia, let's help the Nigerians. Well, how you assess when you can go in, when the peace process is ready, when you send the troops, where they go, who they interface with. And I left out actually one of the most amazing parts of this story from Liberia, which was that we knew that in order to help the peacekeepers come in, we at the consulate, at the embassy, had to make contact with the rebels who were on the other side of the front lines. We had to make contact with them because we didn't know if they were going to attack the peacekeepers. And we didn't know if Charles Taylor's people were going to attack the peacekeepers. So a broad decision to send peacekeepers was in, but were they going to go into a hot war or not? And so at that point, we made a decision to go through the front lines. And the reason we were able to go through the front lines is, one, we got the phone numbers from the journalists. And the second thing is that we saw that relief workers and journalists were actually crossing the front lines. And at that point, we were able to make the decision. So getting back to your question, even though a decision to help broadly was made in response to the media outcry, how you do that and the mechanics are still incredibly important. And all of these different actors play a role in making that happen. And in that particular case, we were able to broker a meeting between the peacekeepers and the rebels who had a bad history from a previous peacekeeping deployment in Liberia that did not go well, build some trust there, and allow the peacekeepers to come in. So again, following the 30,000 foot decision, if we hadn't done that kind of work and our let's say the mechanics didn't move forward, we actually might have had that process stop again, because you would have made the decision and then a week later, because of the speed of information, we said, okay, well that was the decision last week, but now we have to reverse it because that doesn't make sense. Circumstances have changed on the ground. So the continuous flow of information from both the press and people that are working the policy is vital.
I think we could talk all afternoon, but it's past 2 and I'm getting the signals from the other side that it's time to wrap up. So I'm sorry if you don't have time to take questions. Maybe if people can see you for 5 minutes afterwards. So I'd just like to say thanks again, Dante Paradiso. Fascinating talk. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Much appreciated.